My name is Daniel Voss. I am 31 years old. I am sitting in a glass conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Austin, and there is a printed copy of the Forbes article on the table in front of me, still warm from the office printer down the hall, and I have read the headline 4 times without actually processing it as something that happened to me. Outside the window, traffic moves on Congress Avenue the way it always does, indifferent, and my phone has been buzzing on the table so continuously that I finally turned it face down, because I wanted 30 more seconds of a life where this hadn't happened yet before I let the rest of the world back in. 4 days ago, my father texted the family group chat 2 words that would end up, in a roundabout way I never could have planned, becoming the caption on the most shared version of this story. Quit playing around. He was responding to a photo my mother had posted of a magazine feature about fintech founders under 35, a small piece, nothing major, the kind of thing you get written about you in year 3 of a startup when a trade publication needs to fill a page. I was in it. 1 paragraph. My father's response got 31 likes from extended family members who, as far as I could tell, mostly just wanted an excuse to laugh along with him. "Your app is a joke," he added underneath, a minute later, when nobody had disagreed with him yet. I saw it come through at 11:58 on a Tuesday night, sitting at my desk in an office that, at the time, had 4 employees and 11 months of runway left. I didn't reply. I set the phone face down the same way I'd just set it face down in this conference room 4 days ago, and I kept building. I want to tell you how I got from that Tuesday night to this conference room. Because the truth is, my father wasn't wrong to doubt me. He just never once asked why I was so sure. I am the second of 3 sons. My older brother, Ethan, went to law school because our father told him, more than once at the dinner table, that law was a real profession, not a hobby. My younger brother, Cole, works in commercial insurance, a job our father approves of specifically because he understands, roughly, what it is. I was the one who dropped out of a computer science master's program in my 2nd year to build software nobody in my family could explain to their friends. For 9 years, whenever the subject of what I did for a living came up at a family gathering, my father would describe it the same way, almost word for word. Daniel does something with apps. We're not totally sure what. He wasn't being cruel, exactly, not in the beginning. He genuinely didn't understand it. My father spent 34 years as a plant operations manager for a regional manufacturing company, the kind of job with a clear ladder and a clear title at the top of it, and he measured legitimacy by whether a stranger could understand your job in 1 sentence. Software didn't clear that bar for him. Neither did fintech, a word he used when he used it at all, with a faint air of suspicion, like it was a term I'd invented to make something small sound important. The company was called Ledgerine. I started it at 22 with a college friend, Priya Ose, who handled the technical architecture, while I focused on the product and the fundraising. Infrastructure software that let mid-sized banks and credit unions modernize their compliance and transaction monitoring systems without ripping out decades-old core banking software underneath. It is, I promise you, exactly as unglamorous as it sounds, and that unglamorous quality is the entire reason it worked. Every flashy fintech startup in my cohort was trying to build a consumer app. I was trying to fix the plumbing nobody else wanted to look at because I'd worked 1 summer during college doing IT support for a small regional bank, and I'd watched loan officers manually rekey the same customer data into 4 separate systems because none of the software talked to each other. That was the seed of the whole company. Not ambition. Boredom with watching smart people waste their lives on something a machine should have been doing. My father never asked about any of that. He didn't ask what compliance infrastructure meant, or why a bank would pay for it, or how you build trust with a chief risk officer at a 140-year-old credit union who has never once trusted a 24-year-old with anything. He didn't ask because, I came to understand over the years, asking would have meant admitting he didn't already know, and admitting that would have meant treating me like someone whose expertise had outgrown his own. My father has never been comfortable in a room where he isn't the person who understands the most. That was, I'd guess, the 11th or 12th time in 6 years he dismissed the company in front of other people. I stopped keeping an exact count somewhere around year 4, not because it stopped happening, but because counting it had started to feel like waiting for a verdict I'd already decided didn't matter. At my cousin's wedding, when someone asked what I did, my father answered for me, "He's got a little tech thing going. We'll see." At Thanksgiving 2 years ago, when Ledgerine closed its first institutional contract with a credit union out of Ohio, 11 months of sales work, the first real proof the model could work at scale, my father's only comment, over turkey, was to ask Ethan how the partnership track was going at his firm. I didn't argue with him. Not that night, not any of the nights before it. I'd learned, somewhere in my mid-20s, that arguing with my father about my own legitimacy just gave him a stage to perform certainty on, in front of an audience that already agreed with him before I opened my mouth. So I stopped performing my case. I let my work make it instead, on a timeline he couldn't interrupt. There was one specific dinner, about 3 years before all of this, that I still think about more than almost any other. Priya and I had just closed our second institutional client, a credit union out of Western Pennsylvania, and I'd driven 2 hours to my parents' house that weekend, still running on the kind of adrenaline that makes you want to tell anyone what you've built. My father was at the stove finishing dinner, and I told him, carefully trying to make the language as plain as I could, that we'd signed a contract that would put real revenue on the books for the first time, that it validated the whole model, that it meant Priya and I might actually be able to pay ourselves a real salary by spring. He nodded along while he stirred a pot, and when I finished, he asked whether that meant I'd finally be able to afford my own health insurance instead of staying on his plan. Not a single question about the contract, the client, the model, or the 2 years of unpaid work that had led to it. Just the insurance. I answered him, yes, probably by summer, and went and set the table, because the alternative was staying at that stove and asking him why the only part of my life he ever engaged with was the part that made him feel needed. I didn't tell Priya about that dinner for almost a year. When I finally did, she said something I've held on to since. You keep waiting for him to ask the right question. He's never going to ask it. You have to decide if you're building this for you or for an interview you're never going to get. She was right, and it took me longer than I'd like to admit to actually fully believe her. Longer, honestly, than I'm entirely comfortable admitting out loud even now. Before I get to the part that nobody in my family had ever spoken about publicly until 4 days ago, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Because I think a lot of you have sat exactly where I sat that Tuesday night, reading something a parent said about you in front of an audience and choosing to keep building instead of defending yourself. I want to know how many of you understand that choice. Ledgerine's early years were not glamorous, and I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story that skips the boring middle isn't useful to anyone. Priya and I ran the company out of a shared office space for 2 years, splitting a single enterprise sales contractor between us, because we couldn't afford full salaries for either of us until year 3. I learned to read a bank's regulatory filings the way some people learn a language, because I had to understand exactly what a chief compliance officer was afraid of before I could sell them software that solved it. That's the real hidden competence underneath everything that happened later. Not coding, though I could code well enough to be dangerous in the early days. It was understanding risk, the specific institutional fear that runs underneath every regulated financial company, better than almost anyone selling into that market who hadn't spent a decade inside it. I'd spent 1 summer inside it. That was enough if you paid close enough attention, and I paid very close attention because it was the only advantage I had. The early sales process taught me more about my father, oddly, than any conversation with him ever did. Selling compliance software to a credit union's board is an exercise in patient, methodical trust building. You don't win the room with charisma. You win it by understanding exactly what keeps a 62-year-old chief risk officer awake at 3 a.m, and then showing up, meeting after meeting, proving you understand that fear better than the vendor they've used for 15 years. My father would have been good at that work, I think, if he'd ever let himself see it as work instead of as playing around. He spent 34 years managing a factory floor by understanding, in granular detail, exactly what could go wrong on a production line and building processes to prevent it before it happened. I was doing the same thing, just with regulatory risk instead of manufacturing defects. Neither of us ever said that out loud to the other, not once. In all the years I could have used the comparison to make him understand. By year 3, Ledgerine had 4 employees and 3 signed institutional clients. By year 4, we'd raised a Series A from a fintech-focused venture fund out of San Francisco, and I'd hired Marcus Whitlow, a former bank examiner with 18 years at a national regulator, to run our compliance advisory practice, the the single best hire I ever made, because Marcus understood, better than any engineer I could have recruited, exactly which fears to address first when we walked into a boardroom. By year 5, we had 31 employees and 22 institutional clients, mostly regional banks and credit unions between $2 and $40 billion in assets, the exact segment too small for the big enterprise vendors to care about, and too complex for a scrappy consumer fintech app to serve. That gap was the whole business. My father had spent 34 years managing operations at a plant that made industrial fasteners. He understood, better than most people, what it means to build something essential that nobody glamorous ever talks about. He just never made the connection to what I was doing because he never asked enough questions to find it. I saw my brother Ethan twice in the 18 months before this all happened. Once at a birthday dinner for our mother, where he told me, not unkindly, that he'd heard Ledgerine was doing okay, the way you describe a coworker's minor promotion. Once at a 4th of July gathering, where our father spent 40 minutes describing a new grill he'd bought, and Ledgerine came up exactly once, when my aunt asked how it was going and my father answered before I could. Still playing around with it, last I heard. I let it go. I'd been letting it go for years by then, and letting it go had started to feel less like avoidance and more like conservation. I only had so much energy, and I decided a long time ago where it was going to go. What I hadn't told any of them, not my father, not Ethan, not Cole, not even my mother, who I am closer to than anyone else in my family, was that Ledgerine had been in acquisition talks with a publicly traded payments infrastructure company for 11 months. The kind of talks that move at the pace of a geological process, through 6 rounds of due diligence, 3 separate valuation models, and a board committee that needed to be convinced independently 3 separate times that our compliance technology was worth building into their core platform rather than building in-house. I didn't tell my family because there was a version of this deal for most of those 11 months where it fell apart. Acquisitions like this die more often than they close, and I wasn't going to hand my father's story about my failure on top of everything else he already believed about me. There is a particular kind of solitude in building something significant while the people who raised you have no framework for understanding it. I remember the night we signed our Series A term sheet, sitting alone in my car in the parking lot of the venture fund's office building, engine running for the heat, at 3:14 in the afternoon on the last day of the fiscal quarter, because the lawyers had pushed the closing right up against the deadline. I had no one in my family to call who would understand what the number on that page actually meant. I called Priya instead. She didn't say much. She just said, "Your dad's going to lose his mind when he finds out." And for a second I let myself imagine that conversation, and then I put the car in drive and went back to the office, because imagining it wasn't the plan yet. The plan was still just the next client, and the one after that. I want to pause here and say something plainly, because I think it matters more than anything else in the story. I never built Ledgerine to prove my father wrong. I want that understood, clearly. I built it because the problem interested me, because Priya and I were good at solving it together, and because somewhere around year 2, watching a credit union in rural Ohio finally stop losing 4 hours a week to a manual reconciliation process, I understood that this work mattered to people who would never once care what my father thought of it. His opinions stopped being the engine a long time before it stopped being painful. Those are 2 different things, and it took me years to separate them. By year 6, Ledgerine had grown to 51 employees and had expanded past regional credit unions into mid-sized regional banks, the kind with names you'd recognize if you lived in their footprint, but that never made national news. Our largest client processed compliance monitoring for 800,000 accounts through our platform. I mention that number specifically because it's the one Marcus used, in the final round of acquisition due diligence, to answer the acquiring company's only real concern: whether our technology could handle enterprise-scale volume without the kind of failure that would embarrass a publicly traded acquirer 6 months after closing. It could. We'd already proven it, quietly, for 2 years, while my father was still telling relatives I did something with apps. The deal terms were finalized on a Thursday. Full acquisition, cash and stock, valuing Ledgerine at $900 million, a number that still, as I write this, doesn't feel entirely real to me, the way a large enough number stops functioning as a quantity and starts functioning as an abstraction. The acquiring company's public relations team, Per standard practice for a deal of this size involving a publicly traded acquirer, coordinated the announcement with several major business outlets simultaneously, embargoed until a specific Monday morning. Forbes ran the lead story. Fintech infrastructure startup Ledgerine acquired for $900 million. Founder Daniel Voss says the real win was never glamorous. That was the headline. I hadn't seen it before it published. I'd given the interview 3 weeks earlier and mostly forgotten what I'd said, the way you forget most interviews the moment they end. I was in the conference room reviewing final transition documents with Priya and our head of legal when my phone started buzzing on the table, over and over, in a pattern that told me immediately something had shifted before I even looked at the screen. 9 calls in 6 minutes. Cole first, then Ethan, then my mother, then Ethan again. I let it ring twice more before I picked up. It was Ethan, and he was talking before I'd even finished saying hello, his voice pitched somewhere between disbelief and something that sounded almost like fear, the specific fear of a person realizing a story they've told themselves for years has just been publicly, permanently corrected. Is this you? Dan, is this you? Forbes just, Dad's group chat is exploding. Is this actually you? I let him finish before I answered. Yeah, I said. It's me. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that I almost thought the call had dropped. Then Ethan said, quieter, Dad's here. Hang on. And I heard, muffled, my father's voice in the background asking what was going on, and then Ethan reading the headline out loud to him, slowly, the way you read something to a person when you need them to understand it's not a joke. I heard my father say, that can't be the same. And then I heard something else, a small clatter, plastic against a hard surface, and a beat of confused motion on the other end of the line before Ethan came back, half laughing, half something else. The phone slipped out of his hand, he said. Dan, the phone actually slipped out of his hand. I didn't say anything for a second. I reached for the glass of water on the conference table instead, because I'd learned a long time ago that the moment right after something like that lands is not the moment to fill with words. Put him on, I said, when I was ready. There was some shuffling, some muffled conversation I couldn't fully make out, and then my father's voice came through, careful in a way I had never once heard it in 31 years. Daniel. Just my name, the way you'd say it if you were testing whether the ground under a word was solid before putting your full weight on it. Hey, Dad. Is this the article? Is this? He stopped. Started again. 900 million. That's the number, yeah. There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, and somewhere behind him, my mother's voice, and Ethan saying something I couldn't make out. When my father spoke again, his voice had lost the careful testing quality and gone somewhere flatter, somewhere I didn't recognize. I told everyone you were playing around, he said. You did, I said, in the group chat. Everyone saw it. A pause. Cole's uncle-in-law saw it. He works in finance. He asked me about it at Easter. Asked if I was worried about you throwing away your 20s on an app that wasn't going anywhere. I told him I was. I didn't say anything. I let him finish before I spoke, because that had been the rule my whole life with him, whether he ever noticed it or not. I let him finish, and then I decided what was worth answering. I read the article, he said, and there was something happening in his voice now that I want to describe carefully, because it wasn't quite an apology and I don't want to oversell it as one. It was closer to a man doing arithmetic on 31 years and not liking the total, the way you recalculate a number you'd been certain of for so long that the recalculation itself feels like a kind of injury. It said you spent a summer doing IT work at some small bank. That's where this started. Is that I don't remember you telling me that. I told you that summer, I said. You asked if I'd found a real job yet for the fall. Another silence. Longer this time. I didn't understand what you were building, he finally said. I want to say that. I didn't understand it, and instead of asking, he stopped again. My father has never been a man who finishes sentences that end badly for him, and I didn't push him to. Some sentences don't need to be finished to be understood by both people on the call. It's compliance infrastructure, I said quietly, giving him the words he'd never once asked for in 9 years. Banks and credit unions were manually doing work that software should have been doing for them. We automated it. That's the whole company, underneath everything. It was never complicated. You just never asked. I know, he said. And then, after a pause long enough that I thought that might be the end of it, "I'm proud of you, Daniel. I should have said that a long time before today." I want to be honest with you about what that moment felt like, because I think the honest version matters more than the satisfying one. It didn't erase 9 years in a single sentence. I don't think anything could have. But I didn't need it to erase anything. I'd stopped needing his approval to validate the work a long time before Forbes ever printed a word about it. The validation I actually needed, I'd already gotten, in 22 client contracts and 31 employees and a Series A term sheet that took Priya and me 11 months of rejection to land. What my father's call gave me wasn't proof. It was just, finally, an accurate account of what had actually happened, replacing the inaccurate one he'd been telling for years, which turned out to matter more than I expected it to, not because I needed it to be true, but because he finally did. My mother called next, and that conversation was its own kind of consequence, separate from anything my father or Ethan had said. She'd been sitting in the same room when the phone slipped from his hand, and she told me, quietly, that she'd known about the summer at the bank the whole time, that she'd been the one who suggested I take that internship in the first place, back when I was 20, because a friend of hers worked there and needed extra hands. "I never told your father that part," she said. "I don't know why. I think somewhere along the way I decided it was easier to let him believe what he believed than to keep correcting him." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I told her it was okay, and I meant it mostly, though I've thought since about how many small silences like that one had shaped the whole architecture of what my family believed about me, one uncorrected assumption at a time. Cole called an hour later, and that conversation was shorter and, in its own way, more honest. He didn't apologize either, not directly. He asked, instead, whether Ledgerine was hiring. His uncle-in-law's firm did compliance consulting, and Cole wondered if there was a referral relationship worth exploring. It wasn't sentiment. It was business, immediate and practical, the first time in years my family had approached me as someone whose work was worth transacting with instead of explaining away. I told him I'd connect him with our business development lead. It wasn't everything. It was something, and I've learned to take something seriously when it shows up. Priya, sitting across the conference table through most of this, waited until I hung up before she said anything. She'd known the family chat story for years. I'd told her the quit playing around line back when it happened, half joking, the way you tell a founder-co-founder a story you're not sure yet whether to be angry about. She looked at the printed Forbes article on the table between us and said the only thing anyone said to me all day that actually stayed with me afterward. "People who need you to be small don't recover well from finding out you weren't." I didn't have a response for that. I'm not sure I have one still. I've just found myself thinking about it more than I expected to. My father called back the following morning, and that second call told me more than the first one had. The first call, I think, had been shock-talking, the specific, disoriented honesty of a man who hadn't had time yet to build a version of the story he could live with. The second call was calmer, more deliberate, and I want to give him credit for what he actually said because I think it cost him something to say it without the excuse of shock behind it anymore. "I've been thinking about the group chat," he said. "I want to say something in it. Not because Forbes printed a number, because I was wrong about what I told everyone, and I don't want that to just sit there uncorrected." He asked if that was okay with me. I told him it was. 2 hours later, he posted in the same thread where "Quit Playing Around" had gotten 31 likes. I was wrong about Daniel's company. I didn't understand what he was building, and instead of asking, I made a joke out of it. I'm proud of him, and I should have said so a long time ago. It got 44 likes. I don't know if that detail matters to anyone else the way it matters to me, but I noticed it, and I've decided I'm allowed to let it matter. Marcus Whitlow, my head of compliance advisory, stopped by my office 2 days later with a bottle of champagne none of us opened, because we were all too exhausted from transition meetings to drink it properly, and he told me something I've held on to since. "You know what the acquiring company's diligence team told me in the final round?" he said. They said Ledgerine was the first vendor they'd looked at in 3 years where the compliance thinking felt like it came from inside a bank, not outside one. I told him that was because it had. I'd spent one summer inside one, watching smart people waste their lives on work a machine should have been doing, and I'd spent 9 years afterward proving that watching closely enough for long enough could be its own kind of expertise, even when nobody in my family believed a word of it. I want to tell you something, and I want to say it as plainly as I know how. Setting a boundary is not cruelty. When you finally stop explaining yourself to people who've already decided not to listen, when you let your phone go face down instead of arguing your case in a group chat with 31 witnesses, you are not being petty. You are choosing to let the truth arrive on its own schedule instead of yours, which is usually the only version of the truth anyone actually believes. You can love the people who dismissed you and still refuse to keep auditioning for their approval. Love was never supposed to be a transaction where you owe someone your smallness in exchange for staying in the family. My father and I talk more now than we did before all of this. I don't know yet whether that's because something in him actually changed, or because the math changed and he's adjusting to a new total. I've decided it doesn't matter which, as long as the conversations stay honest going forward. The people who choose to see you before there's a headline to force the issue are worth more than the ones who need external proof before they'll believe you. Priya believed in the plumbing nobody else wanted to look at back when it was 2 people and a shared office space and 11 months of runway. Marcus left an 18-year career at a federal regulator to bet on a compliance thesis I hadn't fully proven yet. That kind of belief doesn't show up in a Forbes headline. It's the reason there was ever a headline to write. My mother's quiet complicity is a harder thing to sit with, and I want to be honest about that too, because this isn't a story where everyone around the villain is simply innocent by comparison. She knew the real version of how Ledgerine started for 9 years and let my father keep telling the wrong one, because correcting him, in that house, had never once been worth the argument it would start. I don't blame her for that the way I might have at 25. I understand now how much smaller a house gets when one person has decided, permanently, what the truth is allowed to be. But I've also decided that the next version of my family, the one I build with my own kids someday, if that's the direction my life goes, isn't going to run on that same quiet arithmetic, where staying comfortable matters more than staying accurate. Walking away from people who cast you as the family's cautionary tale is not bitterness. It's the only rational response to being underestimated by people who never once asked you a single real question about what you were building. You cannot prove yourself to an audience that has already decided the verdict before the argument starts. You can only build something so undeniable that the verdict stops mattering on its own timeline, whether or not they're paying attention when it happens. And the quiet that exists on the other side of 9 years of being the family joke, the version of my life where I don't brace for a comment every time someone asks what I do for a living, that quiet is an emptiness. It's what it was always supposed to feel like, underneath everything else. I just had to build a $900 million reason for my father to finally ask me a real question before I found out. My father texted quit playing around because he believed, genuinely, that he was giving me a nudge towards something more serious. He never imagined it would end up printed, essentially word for word, underneath a Forbes headline about the deal that proved him wrong. I kept the printed copy of that Forbes article, the one that was still warm from the printer when this whole afternoon started. It's in a drawer in my desk now, not framed, not displayed anywhere a visitor would see it. I don't need to look at it to remember what it proved. I keep it for the same reason. I imagine my father somewhere still has the version of me he believed in for 9 years, folded up somewhere he doesn't look at often either. Some things you hold on to not because you need them, but because putting them down would mean pretending the distance was never there at all. I want to know, have you ever built something quietly while the people closest to you assumed you were failing? Because if you have, you already understood the story before I finished telling it. The story you just heard was inspired by real experiences shared on public platforms including Reddit and other online communities. It has been thoughtfully adapted and reimagined for storytelling purposes. All characters, situations, names, and settings are fictional, altered, or generated using AI tools. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is entirely coincidental and unintentional. This story was created to deliver positive messages, emotional insight, and meaningful reflection, not to represent or defame any real person or situation.